Hello, welcome to Chapter 15, where we will begin to introduce you to the workings of the Greek contract verbs. Up to this point, all of the verbs that you have learned in this class have ended in one of three ways. Many of your verb stems actually ended with a long vowel, as with luo. In luo there you see that the stem, keep in mind, does not end with the omega. That is not the stem, that's your verb ending, but the stem itself is actually lambda upsilon, and so in the case of lu, it ends with the long vowel upsilon. Other verbs ended with a diphthong, as with the case with therapeuo, where it ends with epsilon upsilon diphthong. And then finally, many words actually just end with a simple consonant, as is the case with the word echo or the word hamartano. This week, as you're looking over Chapter 15, you're being introduced to a new class of verbs that we refer to as contract verbs. And these are verbs in the stem ends with short vowels, either an alpha, an epsilon, or an omicron. And so, for instance, here are some of the ones that you have for this week. Agapao, poieo, timao, laleo, phanerao. Notice how before the verb's personal ending of omega, you have that short vowel alpha, epsilon, or omicron. And you'll be able to tell now when you're learning your Greek vocabulary words if you're dealing with a contract verb by one of two ways. One clue, of course, will be the telltale alpha, epsilon, or omicron that you will see immediately preceding the omega ending. Another way you'll be able to tell, however, is by the telltale hiccup sound. Look what happens when I pronounce these again. Agapao, poieo, timao, laleo, phanerao. Each time I pronounce the verb, when I actually get to the short vowel, there's a little hiccuping noise. And that's one of your other clues then when you're learning your vocabulary that you are learning a contract verb. Now, one thing you do need to be aware of, however, is that although you will learn these verbs as the contract verbs with the little hiccup vowel in there, you will never see these verbs appear this way in the New Testament. You will never see agapao spelled that way in the New Testament. You will never see poieo spelled that way in the New Testament. That's because what you are looking at here on the screen are what we refer to as the lexical form. If you went to the lexicon and you wanted to look up the word agapao for I love, this is exactly how you would see it spelled. But actually, when you read it in the New Testament, it's going to be spelled slightly different. And that's because when Greek contract verbs are conjugated, that is, they're put into their various tenses, they undergo a change. One of two changes will happen to them. They will either go through lengthening or they will go through contraction. Let's take a look at what I mean. We'll start off with the rules for lengthening since these are the most straightforward. Anytime a contract verb, that is, one of those verbs with a little hiccup, appears in either the future, the aorist, or the perfect tense, that little short vowel at the end of the stem will lengthen before its tense suffix. So, for instance, an alpha will lengthen to an eta prior to going in the future aorist tense and taking a sigma suffix. An epsilon will lengthen to an eta before going into the perfect tense and taking the kappa suffix. And finally, an omicron will also lengthen to an omega before taking either the sigma or the kappa suffix. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. On the screen, you'll see that we have the word next to the word future, and then we have agapao, our lexical form for how we say I love in Greek. But as I said, you will never see agapao appear this way in the Greek New Testament. What you will see instead is a variety of other ways it will appear, and when it's in the future tense, you'll notice that what happens is the alpha actually lengthens to an eta before the sigma suffix, and so what you wind up with is agapeso. Now, in the case of agapeso, the only thing that you need to be concerned with here that is different for you is the fact that lengthening has occurred before the sigma suffix. It doesn't change anything about the way you parse this word. This will still be a future active indicative first person singular. And it will still be translated the same way, I shall love. The only thing that you need to be aware of is that prior to that sigma suffix, that alpha will lengthen to an eta. Let's take a look at the next example, which is an aorist tense. In the aorist tense, we use the word poieo, which ends at that epsilon short vowel, or the little hiccup there is poieo. But when we go to the aorist tense, take a look what we have here. First of all, as is common with our aorist tense, we begin with our epsilon augment, okay? And you'll know the word as well, we also have our sigma suffix. Both the augment and the sigma suffix are telltale signs that we are dealing with an aorist tense. But in this case, the epsilon has lengthened to an eta, so that the pronunciation of the word is epoiesin instead of epoiesin, which is what would have happened if we didn't lengthen it, so it's epoiesin. The parsing, though, is still simply aorist active indicative third person singular. And the translation is he, she, or it made, or he, she, or it did. Looking at the last example that you have there on the screen from the word plerao, notice that with plerao we have the short omicron before the omega. When we put this in the perfect tense, then we start off with our reduplication, a very important part of the perfect tense, so it becomes peplerokamen. And our omicron has now lengthened to an omega just prior to our kappa suffix with our alpha endings. So peplerokamen becomes a perfect active indicative, first person plural, we have filled. So before we go too much further, the good news is any time a contract verb appears in either the future, the aorist, or the perfect tense, then everything that you already know about verb tenses applies, and the only thing you need to be aware of is that lengthening will happen just prior to either the sigma or the kappa suffix. Which leaves us then just two more tenses to actually explore with contract verbs, but these are the ones where it becomes slightly more complicated. And I'm talking here, of course, about the present and imperfect tense. In these tenses, the verb stem vowel does not lengthen because there is no suffix. Instead, what it does is it actually contracts and it morphs with the vowels of the verb ending. So, the final short vowels that you learn with these contract verbs of the alpha, the epsilon, and the omicron will actually contract and change when they come in contact with the vowels of the personal endings. Let me give you just some general rules first, and then I want to give you three patterns to be aware of. The biggest general rule for you to be aware of is that anytime any of these three short vowels, the alpha, the epsilon, or the omicron, come in contact with an omega, the result will be simply omega. Take a look at agapao there on your screen. It comes, of course, from agapao. That's the way you will learn it as in your lexicon. But when in the Greek New Testament, when you conjugate agapao with the omega, what happens is it goes through a contraction, and the alpha actually disappears, and it simply becomes agapo. And this would be our present active indicative first person singular, and it means I love. And this is the only way you will see agapao appear in the present tense in the New Testament. It will not appear as agapao, but as agapo. Same thing happens when we deal with the word poieo. Anytime an epsilon comes in contact with an omega in a contract verb, that epsilon will be morphed into the omega, and it becomes simply poio, present active indicative, first person singular, I make or I do. Again, you will never see poieo in the New Testament, but you will see poio. Same thing with the final one there, plerao. Plerao plus the omega becomes plero, present active indicative, first person singular, and it simply means I fill. So that is your general rule. Anytime any of these contract verbs come in contact with an omega, okay, which is going to be the case especially in the present tense in the indicative, but also keep in mind that this will happen when it comes in contact with your subjunctive endings. The result will be that that little short vowel will automatically just become omega. With that in mind, now let's take a look at three special patterns. Pattern 1 is for those verb stems that you're going to learn that are contract verbs, and their stems end with an alpha. Taking a look on the screen, when an alpha comes in contact with either an omicron or the diphthong omicron upsilon, the result will simply be omega. So if you look on the right hand side, you see we have agapa plus our first person plural ending of the present tense, amen. Agapa plus amen equals agapomen. Okay? And so agapomen here is simply a present active indicative first person plural. It becomes we love. Now, yes, there are going to be times when agapomen will look exactly like a present active subjunctive first person plural. How will you know that it is a subjunctive rather than an indicative? Think back to what I taught you. The red flag words that you learned that your clue for the subjunctive will help you. So again, anytime an alpha comes in contact with either an omicron or an omicron upsilon diphthong, the result is omega. Look at the next one. Anytime an alpha comes in contact with any other vowel or diphthong, then the result is alpha. So basically, the alpha basically absorbs any other vowel or vowel combination. And so in this case, take a look at agapa plus the second person singular of the present tense, ace, agapes, is not what you see. Instead, what you get is agapas. Now let's take a look at this for a moment, because what you have here is you have your epsilon iota sigma has now become alpha with an iota subscript plus a final sigma. That has become agapas. Now notice that the iota does not disappear, it becomes an iota subscript. And this alpha here could be caused to give you a little bit of confusion, because you might think that what you're dealing with here is the second person singular of the aorist. Alpha is the alpha sigma of the as. But this cannot be an aorist tense, folks, because keep in mind, in order for it to be an aorist tense, what we would have to have is we'd have to have an augment here. And we still would have to have a sigma suffix, because keep in mind that when a contract verb goes into the aorist tense, it will have lengthening rather than contraction, and that lengthening happens prior to a sigma suffix. So this only happens in the present and the imperfect tense. One other thing to keep in mind is take a look at the next one. Agapla plus the infinitive of the present tense, ain. It becomes agapan. Notice that while all other times the iota subscript will be retained underneath that alpha, when it is in the case of an infinitive, that alpha is not retained. It just simply becomes agapan. So that is special pattern number 1. All verb stems in contract verbs that end with an alpha, when they come in contact plus with an omicron and omicron upsilon, they become an omega. If it comes in contact with any kind of vowel or diphthong after that, those are all turned into an alpha. Pattern 2 is for verb stems ending in an epsilon. When you have an epsilon and it comes in contact with either another epsilon or an epsilon iota, then the result is simply an epsilon iota. So this one's a little bit more straightforward. In this case, look at number 1. We have the word poie from poieo. When poieo is put into the second person singular of the present tense with ace, remember oase, poie plus ace becomes simply poies. And so actually it looks very similar to what you would expect. It's a present active indicative, second person singular, you make or you do. But let's take a look at what happens, however, when an epsilon comes in contact with an omicron in number 2. When that epsilon comes in contact with an omicron, it doesn't get absorbed by the omicron, but actually what happens is the omicron and the epsilon actually morph into the omicron upsilon diphthong. So in this case, let's take a look what happens when we put poieo into the imperfect tense. And in this case, poie plus an amen, and I'm sorry, folks, that should be poie plus an on, omicron nu, and it would become in the imperfect tense a et poion. Wait 1 second, and I will just simply fix this. There we go. Poye plus the Omicron nu that you would expect in either your first person singular or third person plural. All right, when that epsilon on the end of the contract verb comes in contact with the Omicron nu, it becomes poi un. Take a look at that. Now, the poi un on the end is very odd looking, but you have a augment on the front, which is what you would expect in your imperfect tense. And even though when you see that augment, you don't have an alpha ending, you don't have a sigma ending, so the Omicron upsilon nu is unusual looking, but in reality it looks just like the imperfect endings you already know. It just has that rather unusual addition of the upsilon there. It's still an imperfect active indicative, either first person singular or third person plural, either I was making or they were making. Finally, let's take a look at what happens when an epsilon comes in contact with an eta. Okay, anytime an epsilon comes in contact with an eta, it becomes simply an eta. So in this case, we're dealing with a present middle passive of poieo. Remember, o mai, eatai is your singular endings for your middle passives. So when poieo comes in contact with the eta with the iota subscript of the middle passive endings, it simply becomes poie, and it's a present middle passive indicative third person. Second person singular. You are making for yourself, or you are being made. Let's take a look now at special pattern number 3, our final pattern, and this is for those verbs that end in the omicron. Whenever you have an omicron plus an epsilon or another omicron, the result is an omicron upsilon. So in this case, plerao plus an omicron in the amen will simply become plerumen. It's a present active indicative first person plural. We fill. Again, even though there is that unusual addition of the upsilon there, you can see the plerumen. It looks enough like the first person plural of the present active indicative you already know, so it shouldn't cause you too much of a problem. Anytime an omicron comes in contact with an eta, you're going to have an omega. There's not really a whole lot of those, so I'm not going to give you an example of that. But one that you need to be aware of that will cause you potential trip up is when an omicron comes in contact with either an epsilon iota or an eta with an iota subscript, the result is an oi. So looking there at your plerao, which coming in contact with your second person singular ace of the present tense, becomes pleirois. Now this is potentially a trip up. You won't see this a whole lot in the Greek New Testament, but you should be aware of it. Even though the pleirois there actually looks like either a masculine or a neuter dative ending for a noun, what you need to keep in mind with here is that you're dealing with a verb, not a noun, and so that will help you. Yes, there is potential for confusion here, and the good news is I don't really think there are a whole lot of these, if any, in the New Testament, but you do need to be aware of the way the verb stem works. With that in mind, let's take a look at some examples here that I can help you with. On your screen, we've got the word pleiruta, and this comes from the word plerao. It is a present active indicative, second person plural, and it's coming in contact with the eta ending, and that's because anytime you have an omicron, all right, coming in contact with an epsilon, all right, the result is what you see there, that omicron upsilon, all right. So pleiruta is a present active indicative second person plural from plerao, and it means I fill. Agapesomen, coming from agapao. This is our future tense. You can see that what has happened here is just prior to our sigma suffix, that short alpha has lengthened to an eta. So agapao has become agapesomen. It's a future active indicative, first person plural from agapao, which means we will love. Remember, in the future, the aorist, and the perfect tense, contraction is not what takes place, but lengthening just prior to the suffix. Next, we have pleirothemen. Now, in this case, we are dealing with plerao, but notice what we have here. Here we have an aorist passive indicative first person plural. And because it's in the aorist tense, we once again have lengthening. Notice we have our we have our augment on the front, the epsilon. And even though it comes from plerao with an omicron as our short vowel, that omicron has been lengthened to an omega prior to our theta eta suffix, which reminds us that we are dealing with the aorist passive. So the aorist passive of plerao is plerothemen, and it means simply we were filled. Here, from the Greek verb laleo, we have an imperfect tense. We have echlalun. Keep in mind here that we are dealing with the imperfect, so we have our augment. And then our ending is an omicron upsilon new ending, because anytime an epsilon comes in contact with an omicron, the result is omicron upsilon. So we are dealing here with either the imperfect active indicative third plural or first singular. I'm going to choose to go with the third plural in this case, and I will translate this as they were speaking. Next, we have tu agapontas. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, these verbs also appear in the participle form as well. So yes, you'll need to make the adjustments and learn them as well. But again, keep in mind, the same rules apply to participles as they do verbs. Contract verbs, if they appear in the future, the aorist and the perfect tense, that hiccup vowel, that short vowel, will lengthen prior to the suffix. But if they appear in the present tense, remember there's no imperfect tense in the participle, but if they appear in the present tense, then contraction will happen. Looking at our screen here, we have tu agapontas. I know that this is a present active participle, masculine singular genitive. Remember that whenever an alpha comes in contact, all right, with when an alpha comes in contact with an omicron or an omicron upsilon, it automatically becomes an omega, and so in this case it becomes agapontas. Okay, and because it's a present active participle, masculine singular genitive, we translate this of the one loving. Finally, poiekos, coming from poieo. All right, this is a perfect active indicative second person singular. We have on the front of the word our reduplication that we would expect to see. Okay, we also have, prior to our kappa suffix, lengthening is taking place before the kappa. Okay, and so this becomes poiekos. All right, present active indicative, second person singular. You have made or you have done. The good news about contract verbs is that you have no new endings to learn, really. You need to just keep in mind that when you learn these verbs with the little hiccups, that you're dealing with a contract verb, and know that when they appear in the aorist, the future, or the perfect tense, that lengthening will take place with that hiccup vowel. When they appear in the perfect, or the present or the imperfect tense, then contraction will happen. And you need to know these rules for contraction and be able to identify when they appear that way. In preparation for our time together in class, then, I would like you to please learn the vocabulary for Chapter 15, all these contract verbs that we have here. Memorize the rules for lengthening in contract verbs, which is pretty simple. Anything before a suffix just simply lengthens. Memorize the 3 patterns of contraction that we have in contract verbs. Those are, again, for the present and the imperfect tense. And then, as always, do 10 sentences from the Chapter 15 practice sentences. All right. I will see you in class. See you then.